We began our discussion of the role, the efficacy of prayer, and likewise of study of Torah and good deeds in ameliorating the devastating situation in which we find ourselves last time. We did not complete our discussion. I'm hoping we'll be able to get to more of a note of finality, Be'ezrat Hashem, this evening. I stated we were going to have a very brief review for the benefit of any of you who may not have been here last week. The essence, on the one hand, we noted the dissension between Rambam and Ramban regarding the mitzvah of prayer altogether, that Rambam maintains that prayer is a Torah mitzvah. Ramban maintains that either it is or it isn't. But even if it is, it's not the mitzvah that Rambam was describing in his introducing the mitzvah of prayer in Sefer HaMitzvot and in Hilchot Tfilah, laws of prayer in his halachic code. Because for Rambam, as we noted, and of course I'm really telescoping things into a very brief review, prayer is part of one's daily regimen. For Ramban, it is specifically turning to God be'et tzara, in time of distress. And while ostensibly we might think that this will lead to a straightforward dissension between Rambam and Ramban as to whether we regard prayer in Judaism as theurgic, in other words, as being able to lead to supernatural divine intervention. I want to stress what was really the first point that we made last time, and I got a sense of some uncertainties on this score from some of the feedback, and my emphasizing this point at the outset was to avoid that state of affairs, because I had hoped it was clear in our discussion the possibility of, if you will, efficacy in prayer, theurgic prayer, having the consequence of supernatural intervention is straightforward, explicit in Ramban. But the truth is, as we noted, it is no less explicit in Rambam, except not as the mitzvah of prayer. And in this vein, I just want to reiterate the point that we already noted, and that is that Rambam 3 times relates to the mitzvah that is enunciated in Parashat Beha'alotcha of B'hare'otem b'chatzotzerot, the blowing of the trumpets, among the reasons for which is al hatzara tzorer etchem, when there is a time of distress. And while in the first place that Rambam relates to this mitzvah in Sefer HaMitzvot, the emphasis is squarely on the trumpets. He should sivano litgoa b'chatzotzerot b'mikdash. In Hilchot Ta'aniyot, where Rambam focuses upon the Ta'anit, the fast day in particular, as something they would do in time of distress, he presents the one single solitary Torah mitzvah that is addressed in Hilchot Ta'aniyot, specifically in terms of mitzvah taseh min haTorah liz'ok u'leharia b'chatzotzerot, to scream out and blow the trumpets. I'll call tzara shetava tzibur, and manifestly in Hilchot Ta'aniyot, the emphasis is upon screaming out, not the trumpets. And finally, in Moreh HaNevuchim, in Guide of the Perplexed, in Unit 3, Chapter 36, where he's addressing this mitzvah. He says he's addressing this mitzvah from Hilchot Ta'aniyot. It's included in the first of the categories of mitzvot that Rambam presents in Moreh Nevuchim, and the way he characterizes this mitzvah is v'chen mitzvah asher tzivanu litzok elav yitbarach be'eit tzara. What happened to the trumpets? He's not even talking about the trumpets here. He's talking exclusively about the mitzvah of screaming out to God. He cites the verse of V'ariotem b'chatzotzot, but he's not talking about the trumpets. He's talking about screaming out to God. So clearly, screaming out to God in time of distress is something that exists in Rambam no less than in Ramban. Indeed, I made the proposition last time, which I still will reiterate, that Ramban's formulation of the mitzvah of prayer seems to have been overtly appropriated from what Rambam writes in Moreh Nevuchim about the mitzvah of screaming out to God when one is in a state of travail, the mitzvah that is enunciated by the Torah in the context of the trumpets. So certainly, again, this aspect of dialoguing with God is present for them both. It's just important for us to appreciate that that's not the mitzvah of prayer for Rambam. It's a different mitzvah. And as we noted last time, the mitzvah of screaming out in time of distress, which is the subject of Hilchot Ta'aniyot, is in that first category of mitzvot that Rambam introduces in the 14-way subdivision of the mitzvot in Guide of the Perplexed. In the first of those categories, fundamental principles, whereas the mitzvah of prayer is relegated to the 9th category, together with the other mitzvot, except for one, that are presented in Sefer Ahava, the book of love in Rambam's Halachic Code, that aren't intellectual doctrines. They are rather what is necessary in order to formulate the religious personality, as we've discussed it. So there definitely is a critical dissension with respect to what prayer is. Fundamentally, one could argue there's no dissension between them as to whether there's such a thing as theurgic prayer. You can pray to God in time of distress. And neither Rambam nor Ramban would in any way invalidate that. Granted, Ramban explicitly speaks about prayer as something that can be effective even when one isn't worthy. He says this explicitly, in particular with respect to the subject of the Exodus, that Israel was not worthy of being redeemed from Egypt, but they screamed and prayed and God had compassion on them. Whether that would work in Rambam is admittedly much more doubtful. But that we have the wherewithal to dialogue with God, and that God can intervene supernaturally. It's clearly something with respect to which there's no dissension. Indeed, as we have noted in other contexts, from Rambam's perspective, while the Aristotelian doctrine of a primeval universe is not proven and can never be proven, and as a result, we don't feel any urge to capitulate to this doctrine. Besides the fact that we don't have any need to do so, there's also an outright objection to do so, because if the universe as we know it has always existed, which is the Aristotelian concept of a primeval universe, then nature has no author. Nature has no author means nature has no sovereign. Nature has no sovereign means miracles are impossible. There's no such thing as divine intervention. Says Rambam, that contravenes a foundational principle of our beliefs. And this is Rambam, unequivocally, this is Rambam no less than Ramban. It's important for us to emphasize this point. Certainly, believing in the possibility of miraculous divine intervention is categorically foundational in our beliefs, according to both Rambam and Ramban. Now, we're going to have to address this question at greater length when we consider another related topic, the topic of theodicy, suffering of the innocent, that is yet on the list of topics that were solicited with respect to the current situation. That's still in abeyance. But our focus at present again, in trying to complete our discussion of prayer, study of Torah, and good deeds as ameliorating the situation, perhaps most directly can be summarized at present. We're obviously not going to go through all the sources we've discussed here before, in contrasting two principles that we enunciated last time. The one, what is expressed in the Yerushalmi, in tractate Berachot, and I'm focusing upon this pithy line of Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmanei, Im kivanta et libcha b'tfilat hei mevosa shenishme'at tfilatcha. If you directed your heart in prayer, consider yourself heralded that your prayer is heard. Now, of course, there was a condition here. The condition was that you directed your heart. If you didn't direct your heart, all bets are off. But if you directed your heart, you are heralded that your prayer is heard. That, on the one hand. And we'll emphasize in this vein that we noted, likewise, the point that was enunciated in the Gemara, in Tractate Brachot, page 32b, that prayer is greater than good deeds because there was no one who was greater in good deeds than Moshe, and he was answered specifically through his prayer. When God tells him to ascend to the summit of Mount Nebo to see the land that he would not be able to enter, that was because he prayed. And simultaneously, the other side of this coin, as we noted, that with respect to the extent to which prayer leads to the results that we might solicit, the Midrash in Kohelet Rabbah, which in some senses maybe a rejoinder to both of the two sources that I just mentioned. The Midrash says, at times a person strikes in prayer and is answered, at times a person strikes and is not answered. Because there is no one who ordered prayers and supplications more than Moshe. And in the end, what does God say to him? Hein kavu yamech halamut. The day of your death is drawing close, and you're not going in. And of course, with respect to Moshe, we appreciate this is the other side of the same coin. In other words, it's very nice, if you will, for the Gemara to tell us that Moshe was answered not because of his good deeds, but because of his prayer, answered only to the extent of Ale Rosh HaPisgah, ascend to the summit and see the land. But that wasn't what he was asking. He was pleading with God to let him go into the land, and he's not allowed into the land. The day of your death is drawn close, and you're not going in. And the additional dimension that while on the one hand, the Yerushalmi used the formulation of consider yourself heralded that your prayer is heard. Your prayer is heard. Heard doesn't necessarily mean, at least in the facile sense of the term, answered. So the Yerushalmi tells us your prayer is heard. The Midrash tells us here, there are times that a person strikes in prayer and is answered. There are times that a person strikes and is not answered. So it was in that vein that we considered what being heard can mean when it is not answered. And I made a proposition that when we consider the thrust of the Mishnah of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi at the beginning of the second chapter of Avot, in which he tells us, "Dam ma lemala mimach, ayin ro'ah ve'ozen shamat v'chol ma'asera b'sefer michtavim." Know what is above you, a seeing eye, hearing ear, and all of your deeds being recorded in the book. While of course we can understand that as referring to God's eye, God's ear, God's book, It could also be someone is going to see it, someone is going to hear it. And there's this vast book of history, and everything that you do is recorded in that book. In other words, whatever you do will indeed have an effect. It is heard if it is sincere. Every sincere prayer has impact. It doesn't necessarily solicit an answer. And of course, it was in this vein. The last point that we made last time was in considering the Mishnah of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi's son, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, which we could render as do his will as your will, so he will do your will as his will. But I submitted, without going through all of the commentaries who guide us in this direction, that we render it rather as make his will into your will. And then, of course, it becomes a truism that he will make your will into his will, because your will has now become the will of God. Transform your will. Rather than seeking that will be, which will be personally gratifying to your will, refine your will to be the will of God. And then whatever you want is necessarily going to be what God wants. Because you're not looking for some instrumental hedonism. You're not looking for the goods. You're looking for the actualization of God's will on earth. Again, this is something that is enunciated by a great many of the classic commentators. We're not going to go through them because that would take us too far afield. But of course, having stated this is really the threshold that we had left dangling last time. How do we understand the formula of prayer that we employ on a daily basis? Obviously, you could state rightly, and from Rambam's perspective, this is unequivocally foundational, that while there is a mitzvah of prayer on a daily basis, as we expressed it, part of one's daily regimen, the Torah certainly does not prescribe any of the specifics of that regimen of prayer, doesn't give us times of prayer, doesn't give us a formula of prayer by any means. All of that is of rabbinical origin. So what we actually say in our prayers is certainly not something that we regard as reflecting the Torah mandate, which is true, but it doesn't really resolve the problem, because according to Rambam, in the Torah definition of prayer, there is the premise that prayer will include words of praise, words of supplication, words of thanksgiving. So they have supplication. You're asking for something. According to Rambam, unequivocally, let's put this in no uncertain terms at all. If a person in his righteousness says, oh, I don't want anything, I'm not going to issue to God any supplications, I request nothing. What do we say of such a person? According to Rambam, he didn't fulfill the commandment to pray. There's a daily commandment to say words of prayer, and one of the three components that need to be included in that prayer is supplication. If you haven't done that, you haven't prayed. So do we understand that supplication? What does it mean? And what I'll note first, on the most basic plane, and I think it's basic, but it's critical, is the premise enunciated by the Gemara in Tractate Sanhedrin, at the top of the page, when a person prays, he has to see himself as standing before God. In other words, this is not some mental abstraction. You're standing before the king. If you're not asking for anything, if there isn't any dimension of supplication, there is something fundamentally lacking in that cognizance that you're standing before the king, that you have a one-on-one, as it were, with God, that you are addressing God as Baruch Atah Hashem, speaking to him in second person. If you're not doing that, there's something that is fundamentally flawed in your conception of prayer. And of course, to that extent, we also note the words of Rabbi Eliezer in the Mishnah, in the fourth parak of Berachot, Ha'oseh tfilato kva en tfilato tachnunim. That your prayer needs to be words of supplication, not merely some standardized format. And indeed, it is in that vein that we appreciate the thrust of the discussion in the Gemara in Masechet Berachot on this Mishnah. What exactly does kva mean? And without going through the meaning of the various positions here, if you aren't innovating something new as a bakasha, Rashi says, b'bakashato. You're asking for something. If you're asking for something, then it's tfilat kva. Then it's not the fulfillment of the essence of what prayer is supposed to be. And of course, it is in that vein that we consider on a much more sublime plane what supplication can mean, and perhaps what is most startling and simultaneously most edifying in understanding the meaning of supplication is the passage in the first parak of Masechet Berachot, Daf Zayin Amud Aleph, that speaks, as it were, of the Holy One, blessed be He, praying. And while the presumption that he prays is linked to scriptural verse, if I will bring all of those aliens to my holy mountain and gladden them in my house of prayer, then I have a present house of prayer. But what does that prayer comprise? And the Gemara tells us, Amar Rav Zotra bar Tuvia Amar Rav, Yehi ratzon milefanai shichbeshu rachamai et kaasi, v'yagolu rachamai al midotai v'etnehegim banai b'midat rachamim v'eknes them lifni mishat adin. That's a bizarre formulation here. Yehi ratzon milefanai may be the will before me. Whose will? In context, God's will. So what is this conception of supplication when there is absolutely no one who could possibly be regarded as the address for the supplication? And Maharal in Be'er HaGolah, in the fourth Be'er, addresses this bizarre statement in the Gemara, this bizarre Agadah, and what is most germane for our purposes, and I think most critical in our understanding how altogether to relate to the endeavor of lehit palel, is, says Maharal, kasher titbonen b'lashon tefillah hu milashon palel. So tefillah, of course, is the noun form. The root is palel, lehit, palel. And what Maharal proposes is that palel means thought. So it's in this vein that when Yaakov says to Yosef, Re'o fanecha lo filalti, it in essence means, lo chashavti, I didn't think I would ever see you. So palel refers to thought, matters of thought. And he says it's in this vein that the judges are called plilim, because one judges with one's mind, with one's thought. And so tefillah is likewise an expression of thought. Now, hold on to this idea, enunciated by Maharal, and we continue with a somewhat similar, one might even say tantalizingly similar, formulation of Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch. It's tantalizing, although I have to tell you, I don't believe that Rav Hirsch ever saw Maharal. That is, despite the considerable disparity between them, Maharal, after all, passed away in 1609, which is approximately 200 years before Rav Hirsch's birth. Yet it's still, ironically, Maharal's writings were not published popularly after his own lifetime. They only were restored to prominence, actually, a couple of generations ago. I don't think Rav Hirsch was familiar with Maharal. I'm certainly not aware of anywhere where he cites him. And yet there is a certain striking similarity between what Maharal writes and what Rav Hirsch writes. Rav Hirsch, in his commentary on the Torah, this is this week's Sedra, pertaining to the first instance in which we encounter tefillah explicitly in the Torah. Explicitly, as opposed to midrashically. Tefillah appears first when Avimelech gets the divine message to restore Sarah to Avraham, and the assurance, so it would appear, that when you restore her to him, v'yitpalel ba'adecha v'chyeh, he will pray on your behalf and you will live. So v'yitpalel, pray. And I'm going to, if I may, read briefly from what I've excerpted here from Rav Hirsch in English. Of course, Rav Hirsch's commentary in German is inaccessible to me, so whether we read it in Hebrew translation or English translation, it's translation regardless. V'yitpalel ba'adecha, from palel, note, says Rav Hirsch, to judge. Now, it's a little bit different from Maharal. Maharal said machshava. The only thing is that Maharal was also constrained to understand plilim as a reference to the judges, because judgment takes place in one's mind. But Rav Hirsch focuses upon judging as the essential endeavor that Palel identifies. And it's somewhat more sublime than the way I think Rav Hirsch is often presented as that Palel is to judge oneself. There's more to it than that. The judge brings justice and right, the divine truth of matters into the matter, makes it go into and penetrate all phases of the dispute, and by true justice, brings about a harmonious unity in that which without it was clamoring dissension. Doing this to oneself is called hitpalel. Hitpalel means to take the element of God's truth, make it penetrate all phases and conditions of our being and our life, and thereby gain for ourselves the harmonious, even tenor of our whole existence in God. Jewish tefillah is accordingly the most complete contrast to what is generally called prayer. It is not an outflowing from within, an expression of that with which the heart is already filled. For that, we have other expressions, tchina, siach, etc. But it is a renewed intake and penetration of truth which comes from outside. If our prayers were not tefillah, if our praying were not hitpalel, working on our inner self to bring it on the heights of recognition of the truth and the resolutions for serving God, there would be no sense in having fixed times and prescribed forms for them. Now, of course, you rightly note that the fixed times and prescribed forms are midrabanan. They said midrabanan because there is an underlying premise that indeed is a regimen, hence that prayer needs to be done on a daily basis, talking about according to Rambam. And it needs to include those three essential components. The formula is an elaboration on that, but that's what prayer needs to be. In other words, it is formulaic and part of a regimen. And the regimen aspect, of course, is what is of critical importance here. Why is this so bizarre? Were we not speaking about hitpalel, talking about fixed times and prescribed forms? This assumes that periodically at fixed times, the masses of a community are always filled with one and the same state of feelings, one and the same trend of thoughts. Yea, such prayers would rather be superfluous. Feelings and thoughts which are already lively within us have no need for us to be expressed, least of all in set phrases placed in our hands. Where the heart is full, it can always find its own way to express itself, or it can be so full that mere words mean nothing, and inarticulate silence is the only expression of such depths of feeling. Hence, our prescribed prayers are not facts, truths, which they assume we are already fully conscious of, but are such that they wish to awaken, reanimate, and keep ever fresh within us. One can truly say that the less we feel inclined to prayers, the greater is the necessity for saying them. The greater the importance, the greater the effect on us of the work which we have to accomplish on ourselves by tefillah. The lack of the inclination for it is in itself the clearest sign of the clouding over and darkening of that spirit and that recognition of the great truth, which tefillah does not assume us to have, but which it is rather to create, animate, and set right in us. So I note in this regard as a kind of pithy formulation that inevitably comes to mind here, the formulation of Rabbi Moshe Ibn Ezra, Dvarim hayotzim min halev nichnasim el halev. So there's a need then to have the heart involved, because prayer ultimately, as we saw from the get-go in Rambam's characterization of the mitzvah, is indeed avodah shebalev. It is serving God in one's heart. And it's in this vein that we can well appreciate, I think, what Rabbi Yehuda Levi has to tell us on the subject of tefillah. So I'm citing briefly in Sefer HaKuzarei a number of germane excerpts in the third treatise of Sefer HaKuzarei in section 17, where Rabbi Yehuda Levi discusses the order of the three opening brachot. And we ask ourselves, so what are these brachot, praise of God, intended to accomplish within us? What are they intended to accomplish? To express it in terms of the essential, if you will, theological lessons. The first bracha, avot, is relating to God in terms of the God of historical experience. The second bracha, gevurot, is relating to God in terms of our experience of nature. As we've noted in other contexts, history takes precedence over nature, because for Rabbi Yehuda Levi, nature is the basis of both faithfulness to God and rebelliousness against God. It depends on how you take it. History is more unequivocal. And as for the third bracha, Kedushat Hashem, Kedushat Hashem is affirming divine transcendence. Okay, you don't affirm divine transcendence until you've enunciated divine immanence. Why? Because you need to establish a sense of a connectedness with God. And it is likewise in this vein that we appreciate the supplications in the Amidah. The supplications, Rabbi Yehuda Levi, considering the first of those supplications, why is the first thing that we solicit hasechel v'atvuna b'avodat ha'eloka, the intellect, understanding, because through them a person draws near to God. In other words, ultimately the supplications are there, number one, in order to be able to employ all of those gifts that we are seeking, appropriate them as means through which to draw closer to God. And of course, you could say simultaneously, this application is intended in order to drive home the awareness that ultimately all of these gifts have only one source in God. So again, it's going to be a matter of facilely soliciting the goods because we whine enough? No. But this is all intended to draw us to God and to bring God into our lives. And perhaps most of all, I focus upon what Rabbi Yehuda Levi tells us in the third treatise in section 5. Now, in section 5, the Chaver is responding to the solicitation by the king to describe the concept of the Chassid from the perspective of Judaism. What is the Chassid? What is the archetypal pious man? And what Rabbi Yehuda Levi presents to us through his mouthpiece of the Chaver is most essentially a portrayal of how the Chassid readies himself for prayer. And in his presentation here, we're not going to read it inside, but going to appropriate from what he writes two critically important themes. One critically important theme is there is a tension in this presentation, if you will. When the Chassid is readying himself for prayer, he realizes he's grappling with inputs pertaining to a sense of reality coming from both reasoning and his experience. In the parlance of Ibn Tibbon's translation, both svara and dimyon. I'm glossing over things here, but I think it will suffice for our purposes. Yeah, you need to be suspicious of all inputs that pertain to reality because we can readily be misled and derailed from our own tendentiousness in tending towards certain conclusions, even if they aren't really substantiated. And then he describes the Chassid as charging his imagination to cause to pass before his eyes as an imitation of the divine essence that is sought. The glorious, magnificent images that he has stored up in his memory of the instances in which we experience God's presence in the world, the theophany at Sinai, and so on and so forth, without going through the list. And after all of this, in marked contrast to the apparent equivalence with which he expresses distrust of both the inputs of reasoning and experience, go'er bisvara u'visdaneha. He literally yells at his reasoning and its interference to not confuse him with respect to truth and to not introduce to him doubts with respect to it. Now, notice that the equivalence in the distrust of reasoning and experience has been sundered. In order to pray, you need to be particularly belligerent towards your reasoning. That's what seems to emerge here. Why so? Because truth be told, as he stated explicitly, in summoning the imagination to cause to pass before his eyes these glorious, magnificent images of divine revelation, excuse me, you didn't see them yourself. You know why you have to yell at reasoning to keep it quiet? Because when do you yell at your adversary? When you don't have a good argument. You don't have a good argument against reasoning. Reasoning is telling you this is all imaginary. And on some plane it is. And that's why you need to shut it down. Because the whole role of prayer is to guide a person to a certain state of consciousness. And why is that important? Because that in itself is transformative. That is precisely what makes you into someone new. And that brings me to the second point that I'm going to appropriate from this passage without going through it inside, and that is the analogy that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi establishes between the role of prayer for the soul and the role of food, material nourishment for the body. That just as you eat a meal and after a time you get hungry and you need to eat again, so too you pray, not in order to generate something that is specifically to head outward, but rather on the contrary, to recharge the spiritual batteries inwardly. Now, there's an obvious question to ask here. With respect to the physical act of eating, we recognize you can't just eat once and be finished for life, because being physically alive in this world eventually depletes your stores of energy and nutrition, and you need to eat again. Why with prayer do you need to pray again? And of course, inevitably the answer is because it's the same thing. That is, if indeed one lived in a domain that was completely isolated from any spiritual challenge, then conceivably prayer would be itself superfluous. Well, indeed, the Gemara speaks of the template of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, individuals who reached the level in which their preoccupation was so exclusively in Torah that they didn't need to pray. But we live in this world, and living in this world means being constantly exposed to the spiritually corrosive effects of being in this world. So you need to extricate yourself, to pray, to recharge your spiritual batteries, as it were, to rejuvenate, and then to be able to sally forth back into the world to confront its challenges, precisely because that's what life is all about, confronting those challenges. And note, then, again, the critical message of what prayer is to achieve something that is transformative in you. Yes, there is a supplication, and again, the supplication needs to be understood in terms of, number one, what's really important to solicit, and everything that we solicit is going to pertain to the manner in which we establish an ongoing relationship with God. And number two, to appreciate that God is the source of all that is and all that we could possibly solicit. And that's also part of the spiritual mission that prayer imposes upon us. So ultimately, this transformation is a transformation that is internal. And while there are many passages on the subject of prayer in Tanakh that I could cite to illustrate this point, for our purposes at present, I'm going to cite just one that is, I think, particularly striking. The second chapter of Yonah begins, of course, with the words, Vayitpalel Yonah el Hashem Elokav mim'ei hadaga. Yonah prayed to God his Lord from the innards of the fish. So I always like to present this as a thought experiment. If you were praying to God from the innards of a fish, what do you think you'd be saying? How about, get me out of here? And what is conspicuously missing from Yonah's prayer? There's no getting out, get me out of here. He never says it. There's no solicitation for him to get him out of the fish. So what makes it prayer? But given everything we've seen until now, we appreciate very well what makes it prayer. That is, to place it in more fundamental and simultaneously sublime terms, the question we need to ask ourselves at the outset is, how did Yonah get into the belly of this fish in the first place? Because in the third verse of chapter 1, Vayakom Yonah livroch tarshisha milifnei Hashem. How did Yonah get into the belly of the fish? Because he was running away not from God. He's not obtuse. He realizes you can't run away from God. He's running away from the level of lifnei Hashem, from standing before God, from the intimacy with God. That, of course, necessarily is dependent upon being in Eretz Yisrael, in the land of prophecy. But again, bottom line, in effect, what took place at the beginning of Yonah was God called, and Yonah hung up on him. And so the role of chapter 2, Yonah's prayer, isn't seeking some instrumental amelioration of his circumstances. The role of chapter 2 is Yana picks up the phone and dials again. The establishment of a connection. And that, more than anything else, ultimately is what prayer is about. That is the essential message of Asaph in Tehillim, the end of Psalm 73, Vani kivat Elokim litov. The realization that what defines the good for me is closeness to God. And it's in this vein that, if anything, if you want to talk about what prayer does, there is a striking formulation in the Midrash in Shmot Rabbah, commenting on a verse that we know very well from the Slichot, Shomea tefillah adecha kol basar yavo. God is described as the one who hears prayer, and unto him all flesh comes. Now, adecha, on the one hand, literally means unto you, but we appreciate that adi is also a word that means ornament. And the Midrash provides us with a breathtaking description here that, on the one hand, when Israel engage in prayer, everyone is doing his own thing, different times, different places. Kol knesiyah uknesiyah mipalel b'fnei atzma. And when all of the assemblies finish all of the prayers, HaMalach HaMemuneh al Tfilot notel kol Tfilot shitpalu b'chol HaKnesiyot kulam v'yoseh otan atarot v'notnan berosho shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. This very graphic and admittedly very corporeal description of the angel charged with prayer, taking all of the prayers that were prayed by all of these assemblies and making crowns and placing them, as it were, on God's head. That adecha is understood as an ornament, is understood as a crown. And the bottom line enunciated in the Midrash, and I have to admit that most people study Midrash in the European versions, which don't have vowels. So you see the last line, Shakadosh Baruch Hu mit'ater b'tfilatan shel Yisrael. The Holy One, blessed be He, is crowned through the prayers of Israel. And then you see this verse from Yechezkel. If you don't look it up, you might think it's Shnema v'ater tiferet b'roshecha. This crown of glory upon your head, so to speak, referring to God. Except that's not what it says. It's v'ater tiferet b'roshech. The feminine form, because it's referring to Israel. This crown of glory is upon your head, Israel. So, how does that serve as a proof text for the Midrashic assertion that the Holy One, blessed be He, is crowned by the prayers of Israel? And on some plane, we can cite here the formulation that we know from the Zohar, that there is an inseparable oneness of the Holy One, blessed be He, the Torah, and Israel. So, if Israel is crowned by its prayers, then, as it were, so is the Holy One, blessed be He. And if we want to seek a formulation that enables us to speak of the efficacy of prayer, the effect of prayer, I can think of none better. Ultimately, the effect of prayer is indeed to transform us, to transform ourselves. And it is in that vein that we appreciate, if you will, on the most facile plane, that if a decree was decreed upon a person, that was a decree decreed upon the person as he had been. If his prayer transformed him, he's no longer the same person. Indeed, on some plane, we can perhaps well understand the dynamism in what is arguably the first prayer that is mentioned in this week's parasha, even though it's not identified as prayer, and that is when Abraham is interceding on behalf of Sodom and Amorah, the 5 cities. And one wonders what animates this seeming bargaining, going from 50 to 45 to 40 to 30 to 20 to 10. And on some plane, we appreciate that the underlying contention of Abraham is that there would be a terrible desecration of God's name by the extermination of the righteous with the wicked. So it doesn't start off with asking for 10. Of course, there are multiple answers that we can provide here. But on some plane, we could also say that Abraham is himself transformed by each successive prayer to recognize that there would be an element of a desecration of God's name, even if the number of righteous people was lesser. And that's the progression as he progresses through his prayer. So, of course, on that plane, are we speaking of theurgic prayer? I don't know. It depends what we mean by theurgy. That is, we certainly believe that God can intervene in human affairs. That's absolutely foundational. One who does not believe that is outside of the fold. Rambam makes this point very clear in his repudiation of the Aristotelian doctrine of a primeval universe, as we noted earlier. But simultaneously, it's not like this is some magical intervention. It is the arduous process of transforming oneself. Is it going to be efficacious in terms of getting the goods? It may, and it certainly may not. But that transformative process is indeed of foundational importance. Now, inevitably, I need to append to this the additional dimension that was part of the underlying question that we're addressing before we get to study of Torah and good deeds, which are really an almost trivial corollary about what I'm about to say. And that is, so I can understand how my prayer can transform me, but my prayer is not transforming someone else. So of what efficacy can my prayer possibly be as bestowing merit on another person? And inevitably, to answer this question, we need to invoke an additional construct. The additional construct, which has been completely absent from the discussion heretofore, is we are not only individuals. There is such a thing as a klal, as a larger group. And membership in that larger group has implications. It has implications to each of us, bestowing upon us merit of belonging to that group, concomitantly the responsibility and conceivably the culpability for belonging to that group. Recall 2 weeks ago, we talked about the decree of the destruction as being consequent to the heinous crime of gruesome mass murder perpetrated by Amatzia and his contemporaries against the Bnei Seir, throwing them off a cliff. And we continue to be affected by that. Because when you go into a group, you partake of its blessings, you also partake of its liabilities. And besides that of which we partake, both for better and for worse, what we contribute, our responsibility, obviously, again, for better and for worse. If we engage in criminal acts, we have imposed liability, culpability upon the group at large, even those who are not guilty themselves. They may still suffer because of the culpability we imposed upon the group through our membership in the group and our bankrupt actions, as was indeed the case with Amatzia and his contemporaries. And simultaneously, on the positive plane, when we engage in a spiritually exalted and exalting act, so how does it affect the group? It affects the group because the group itself is lifted up through what we have done. To put it in very concrete, almost simplistically vulgar terms, I'll say, well, if you really belong to a group, if you feel that bond of empathy with the other group members, and you have lifted yourself up to a level of worthiness in which you are unworthy of being subjected to the grief, the trauma of something happening to another member of the group, then your merit can protect that other person. It's not going to protect the other person in the hereafter, in the world to come. That's a different story. But in this world, conceivably, the merit of one individual in a group can be efficacious for others, in as much as if something bad happens to another member of the group, then it's going to be trauma for him and also grief for him. But on a more sublime plane, I'm going to say, if we appreciate that the group is on some plane an organic whole, it's even more than that. In this world, indeed, there can be such a thing as group merit versus group culpability. It is, after all, in that vein that the Gemara tells us that if tragedy strikes one member of a group, that all the members of the group should be worried. Again, we can understand it on the more prosaic plane of evidently they did not have enough merit of their own to be spared the grief of something happening to their buddy. And on a more sublime plane, because if something happened to one member of the group, then it implies the group as a whole has a compromised stature. Now, again, this isn't a matter of guarantees one way or the other, but if we ask ourselves, is it possible for my prayer to bestow merit on other members of the group? Well, we have no further to go than consider the three archetypal cases that we read in the Torah, one of which, of course, is this week's Sedra. The first isn't explicit in the Torah, but implicitly so, the story of Noach. What is perhaps the closest to an explicit allusion to Noach's own lack of intervention for his contemporaries is, of course, the famous indictment pertaining to the flood being called in Yeshayahu, chapter 54, May Noach, the waters of Noach. So has Noach earned having this awful plaque with his name on it on the waters of the flood? Because he didn't do anything to ameliorate the situation, not summoning his contemporaries to repent, not entreating God on their behalf. So the whole flood is credited, as it were, to him. Then we have the next case. The next case is Abraham. Abraham interceding on behalf of the 5 cities, striving to avert the decree of destruction against them, which is obviously a crucial step beyond Noach's implicit inactivity. And yet still, Abraham fails, and the cities are destroyed. And then the third template, the third archetypal case, Moshe. Moshe, on behalf of Am Yisrael, first and foremost, the golden calf. And Moshe interceding on behalf of the nation, and by consequence of his intervention, the nation not being destroyed. And we ask, so how did he succeed? What was the formula? And I think we should appreciate that the essential formula can be distilled from one single solitary line that Moshe says. Ve'ata im tisach hatatam, ve'im ayin mecheni na misifrecha asher katavta. If you bear their sin, fine. If not, erase me from the book that you've written. Erase me from the book that you've written, of course, could be understood as referring to the Torah, but more fundamentally, it's the book of life. You can't do anything to them without doing it to me as well, because I'm part of them. Because I am so totally identified with them that whatever you do to them, you've got to do to me. It worked. Moshe isn't worthy of extirpation, and his merit is what saves the entire nation as well. And again, I reiterate, we can understand that on the simplistic plane. I'm going to deem this a simplistic plane, that Moshe is unworthy of being subjected to the trauma and grief of the rest of the nation being destroyed, which is valid as an argument for how Moshe's intercession can save them. But on a more sublime plane, once we recognize that a group has ontological significance, a nation is something. So the nation includes within it the sum total merit of all of its members, and also the sum total culpability of all of its members. If there's enough merit from one member, that merit being the merit of Moshe, then it protects the entire nation. Obviously, the same idea applies also to study of Torah. That is, with study of Torah, arguably, it is a more straightforward process, simply because we recognize that the whole essence of Torah is something that transforms, even more than good deeds. And of course, this brings us back to the Gemara in Masechet Sotah, Daf Kaf Aleph, that we noted at the outset, Torah magna u'matzla. That Torah indeed protects and saves. How does it protect and save more than doing a mitzvah? Because it transforms you more than when you do a mitzvah. And that transformation, again, number one, is transformative in terms of the merit that you bestow upon others. Number two, it's transformative in terms of the merit of the group that you confer upon the group because you're a member of the group. Obviously, a critical aspect of this, perhaps the most critical take-home, when we consider not merely how my own prayer, my own good deeds, my own study of Torah affects me, but how it affects the larger group, is the critical importance of being part of that group, of recognizing that there's such a thing as a klal. If one lives only to oneself, then indeed, arguably, none of this works. We don't live as only individuals on our own in isolation. We live as part of the klal, and we see everything that we're doing as part of the klal. And indeed, on that plane, we pray that our prayers, our good deeds, and their study of Torah should all be for the merit of not only ourselves, for the merit of the klal, of all of Klal Yisrael. Again, for the merit of our holy soldiers amassed at the battle lines, the merit of all those who are kidnapped and being held hostage, the merit of all those who are wounded, injured, and ailing, that they may have complete and speedy recoveries, and the Ilui Shema, memory, all those who were taken from us. May God heal the breach, and may we witness his salvation speedily in our days. Now, just before we conclude, one point I do want to stress, and that is, it's important for us to appreciate the efficaciousness of prayer, good deeds, Torah study on behalf of another is something that only applies in this world, not in Olam Haba. And this is a distinction that the Midrash draws in Midrash Tanchuma Parashat Noach, Piska Gimel, a very well-known Piska in Midrash Tanchuma, pertaining to Ba'alei Talmud. And the part that's relevant for our purposes is the realization that in Kriyat Shema, we have the first parasha of Shema that is cast in the singular and doesn't say anything about reward. And the second parasha, Parashat Vayam Shemoah, is cast in the plural and does speak about reward. And the important distinction to appreciate, the Midrash passes the first parasha is talking about Olam Haba, the Ba'alei Talmud. It's in the singular because every individual has whatever share in Olam Haba is commensurate with that individual as an individual. Whereas in this world, that's the subject of Parashat Vayam Shemoah, where we do speak of this worldly reward with respect to the klal. For the klal, indeed, one individual can supplement another. The klal can bestow zuchuyot on the individuals of whom the klal is composed. That works, again, in this world. That doesn't work in Olam Haba. So it's more for us to appreciate that salient feature, that distinction. But at the end of the day, there is then the wherewithal, both for the individual to, through his commiseration and empathy with another, to bestow his reward, his merit on that other, and in broader outline, the realization that in this world where there is a concept of a klal, that the actions of all individuals, both for better and for worse, can either raise up or the opposite, or lower the level of the klal. In any case, to that extent, that we have something of a handle on the extent to which we can, we hope, only bestow merit upon the rest of Klal Yisrael. So he's clear that our study of Torah should indeed be for the merit of all of Klal Yisrael, in particular our holy soldiers, especially those massing at the border and have already gone in to Gaza, and the wounded, the injured, the ailing, and the kidnapped, the hostages, and Lavdil ben Chaim l'Chaim, those who are no longer with us. Leilu Neshama.